on the right hand side at the top of your screen, you should see the little chat feature that you can submit questions, and we can answer questions as we go, really informal process that we have going on. And if you want to be able to see the full screen rather than seeing who's on at the top, there's this little box, or not box, but a little thing in the middle that says view everyone, and you can change it to hide everyone so you can see the slideshow a little better. So hopefully that was kind of a little bit of the housekeeping. As I mentioned earlier, this is our first time doing a webinar of these sorts, so bear with us. Hopefully we won't have any technical difficulties other than a couple we've already have, but I think we've kind of worked through those. And so hopefully this will be an informative presentation for everyone. All right, so I'll hop into who I am. First off, I'm Megan Ademeyer, and I've been with the Clallam Conservation District now for, I think, going on 16 years, and then I volunteered for a couple years prior to that. And I love working here. It's just a wonderful job. Love everyone that we get to work with. And then my coworker, Jennifer Bond, will be talking later. I'm going to present the first half of this webinar, and then she's going to hop on for the second half of the webinar. And so we'll just work through, and I think I know one of the people on here, I think two of the people on here we've worked with before. So you guys kind of know a little bit about us, and we're happy to follow up with any questions or any more assistance after this webinar. Okay, so I'm going to hop right in. Conservation districts are nationwide, and they're grassroots organizations that are dedicated to protecting and improving natural resources. So we were created in the Dust Bowl era, and here we are. We've definitely changed gears on what we were originally created to do back in the 40s and 50s, but we're still kind of adapting to whatever folks really need to help the resources that we have in our area, in our county. So we provide assistance to land users to help protect and conserve natural resources. Here in Clallam County, we serve all of Clallam County's landowners and land users. And our services are all free of charge, other than our soil testing program. We do charge for that. That's just because we send it off to a lab. And everything we do is non-regulatory, so we don't deal with permits or fines or anything like that. We're not actually affiliated with Clallam County. We are a subdivision of state government. So luckily, we are truly just here to help folks, and we don't have to mess around with the permits and fines and things like that. You can find more information about us on our website, www.clallamcd.org. So to get into the reason that we're here tonight, what is a mud-free pen? So when we refer to these mud-free pens, what we're talking about is a gravel pad that horses and livestock are confined to during the wet season. And typically they're constructed with a material called geotextile fabric, which we'll get into what that material is later on in the presentation, and also a minimum of 6 inches of crushed rock to create a firm surface. So you can see here in this slide, the native soil is under, or I'm sorry, the photo, the native soil is on the bottom, then you have the geotextile fabric, and you have the gravel. And the main reason for this fabric is it allows the gravel to float on top of the native soil so it doesn't sink down in. Otherwise, if you were to skip this and just put gravel down on your native soils, the gravel would sink and the mud would ooze up through, and you would still have a mud problem, and you wouldn't have your mud-free pen like we're hoping folks will make. So these are really important management pieces, especially on small acreage properties, in keeping horses and livestock, especially during the winter time. And we may accidentally refer to them through the presentation as heavy use areas, because that's oftentimes what we term them. Heavy use areas, mud-free pens, we kind of use the term interchangeably. And there are also some folks refer to them as confinement areas, since that's where the animal will be confined a lot of times during the winter. Winter pens and paddocks, and then sacrifice areas. So there's a few different terms that go around there, but kind of mud-free pen is what we're calling them for this particular webinar. And a lot of times these are going to be built adjacent to barns and shelters. since that is where you're going to get most of your heavy traffic during the winter time. So where you're feeding animals in the winter, folks will also build this style of mud-free area around water facilities or around gate areas, just to make sure that those heavy traffic areas are going to stay mud-free during the winter time when we get a lot of moisture. Okay, so why create a mud-free pen? One of the main reasons that we really try to push this is to help create healthier pastures. If horses or livestock are out on pastures year-round, they become very overgrazed, and in the wintertime, soils get very saturated, and so if animals are out on them, on the pastures during the wintertime, it compacts the soil, it decreases the pore space, which is very important for roots, grass roots, and then also for holding water during the summertime months. Those little pore spaces can hold more water and help your grass grow longer. And then just all of the compaction and the heavy traffic can lead to a lot of bare areas and muddy areas in a pasture. So the mud-free pens, the heavy use areas, they are very important for keeping your pastures healthy year-round. It's also very important for healthier animals. There's a lot of hoof problems associated with animals that are in muddy pens, and as well as temperature, kind of regulating the temperature on an animal in very cold temperatures when they're out in mud. It can be a lot harder for them to kind of keep the body weight on. So having them on a mud-free pen, it helps them regulate their temperature a lot better than having wet feet all the time. A mud-free pen also helps enable proper manure management, so your animals aren't standing in all that mud, which therefore also will help protect nearby water quality. As you can see in that photo, this animal has a seasonal, most likely seasonal stream that runs right through the middle of an area that's confined to, probably during the winter time or maybe even year round. And all those bare soils are sloping right into that waterway, and getting into that waterway, which is bad for fish and bad for shellfish, and just not something we want to have going on. And these mud-free pens are also very useful year-round to regulate grazing. So for folks who are worried about their horses ingesting too much grass and foundering, this can be really useful to put them in these pens during the summertime, so you can kind of just turn them out to graze for a couple hours a day, then turn them into the pen, and you have a great area that you're not worried about them ingesting grass and therefore foundering. Okay, so we're going to get into the construction part of building these. So I'm just going to go through the steps, and then I'll elaborate on these steps as I go along. So the first thing is to select a suitable site, and then you want to eliminate all the surface water that's flowing into the area. So things like roof runoff or any seasonal drainage you want to eliminate before you build that area. You don't want those things going into the area. Then you want to grade it. Usually we want to see about a 1 to 2% slope, and remove the organic material when you're grading it. And then you cover the prepared ground with the geotextile fabric. You build a perimeter around the area to retain the footing that you're going to add. And then you spread at least 6 inches of crushed rock. We really like the 5/8 minus, which I'll get into in a moment. And then some folks apply top footing, not everyone does, but it's something that can be used. And then the last kind of key part is to try to make sure there's a grass filter strip around the area. There will be a little bit of overland flow just in heavy rainstorms that can fall on these gravel pens and cause manure to kind of flow off of it. So it's great to have a grass filter strip to kind of take up any of those nutrients that are coming off the pen, and make sure they're not getting into any potential surrounding waterways. Okay, so the first thing is to select a good site. You want to try to pick a high and dry location away from streams, ditches, wetlands, ponds, and as far away from a domestic well as you can get as well. So, many people are already using existing barn or shelter that they have. If you can build new and create it at the same time you do your barn, then that's where you'd also try to site your barn away from these items as well, away from all waterways. So typically the pens are going to be built next to an existing barn or shelter, just so that they can also, be easy to feed the animals in, to get in to clean up manure, And then it's great if you can even incorporate these gravel sites as a way that a hay truck could access your barn. So that, you know, if you need to get a hay delivery or something in the middle of the winter, you can hopefully open up gates and they could drive through that gravel area and get right into your barn if you didn't already have some kind of a gravel driveway going to it. It's also a really good idea to think about lighting if you're able to put up some lights so that you're not out there cleaning up manure in the dark out of the pens, because you do, as Jennifer's going to touch on, want to clean these areas daily if possible, but even every 2 to 3 days can work out as well. And so in terms of selecting a site, you also want to make sure you divert any drainage water away from the area before construction. So if you have some kind of a ditch or just some kind of you know, spring or anything like that that's kind of seeping towards that area, you want to try to divert that beforehand so that it's not getting into that gravel area. So just to kind of put into perspective how much rainfall we get, it really ranges in our county. In Sequim, we get about 16 inches, in Port Angeles, roughly 25, then 45 in Joyce, and 118 in Forks. So basically, the further west you go, a lot of times a rule of thumb is about, you know, 1 mile west is roughly an inch increase in rain. And then it also does increase in the foothills as well as you go up in elevation. But really, it just does show kind of a good, you know, range that we have in our county. It's very diverse. But what's interesting is that even in Sequim, you would think with the low rainfall, we wouldn't get that much mud as compared to Forks. But interestingly enough, the soils in Sequim, they're not terribly well drained. Same with Port Angeles and Joyce, not very well drained at all. So we tend to get a lot of mud in these areas, even though it gets less rainfall in Forks, because Forks has some very well drained soils. So really, we've found that countywide, there's not very many soils that can get away with not having a gravel type of pen in order to have a mud-free winter. Most of the time, they're really necessary to have. And again, as I mentioned, you want to install that drainage to divert any seasonal water away from the area. So kind of an interesting number is that just 1 inch of rain falling on a 1,000 square foot roof will produce 625 gallons of water. So it's very important to try to keep any, even if it's just a small shelter, but any roof runoff that you can out of the gravel area. Because even, you know, just a small little shelter can produce a lot of gallons of water a year. So you want to try to keep clean water clean. That's why we really like to see the gutters and downspouts on there. And you want to make sure you bury the line from the downspout about 1 foot deep at least, just to make sure that you're not going to be, you know, driving over it and breaking it. It's actually better to go even deeper if you can, and then either drain it into a dry well or into a suitable area, like a vegetated area that's away from animals and buildings. And then the other key piece is to make sure you protect the downspouts from horses and livestock. A lot of times they'll rub up against those metal downspouts and just completely crush them. So a better way to go is like a very thick plastic pipe, like a sewer pipe or a metal pipe or something that you can get to encase them. I've even seen people use tires around the downspouts if they have cattle, you know, put the downspout on a sturdy post and then surround them with tires just to protect it. But really protecting those downspouts is key to making sure that they're not going to get ruined right off the bat. So here's one example, on-farm example of what they have done with roof runoff. That's just kind of a neat way to be able to capture the runoff coming off their barn or shelters and utilizing it for stock watering. So basically, the roof water is directed into a stock tank or rain barrel. And then in the case of the rain barrel, there's actually a hose down there and a little spigot that they can use to empty it out. And if it starts to overflow, they can, you know, let some water out as well in the winter time. But that way they're using it for gardening or maybe some flowers or something like that in that rain barrel. And then on the photo with the horse there, this one actually has a downspout diverter. It's a little bit hard to see, but it's that green block coming down on the downspout. And the downspout diverter fills up the tank, and the tank has a float valve. Once that tank is filled up, the float valve comes up and it trips all the water back into that little downspout diverter and back out into dry wells. So it's a really neat way to fill up their stock tank and then have any of the excess just continue to go back out and into a dry well. And a dry well is just basically a big pit that is sized based on the size of your barn or your shelter roof, and usually filled with drain rock and then covered back up with native soil. And that big pit filled with drain rock will be able to take the roof runoff coming off of your roof and then just slowly filter it into the ground. So since I mentioned dry well, I figured I better back up and kind of talk about what exactly a dry well is. So those are some examples of what you can do with roof runoff if you don't want to just let it go into the ground and kind of be, you know, quote, wasted. Okay, so the next step after you divert your roof runoff and you have your site picked out is you want to grade and prepare the site. So you want to remove any sod or any organic material such as manure that is in the area that you're going to make your mud-free pen. And you want to try to achieve a slope of about 1 to 2% away from the barn or shelter to make sure that no water is going to come back into your barn, and also so that you can get a little bit of runoff of any rain that does fall in that area so you don't get ponding. Some of the folks that have built pens that are fairly flat have found that there is a little bit of ponding, and so really the 1 to 2% has been kind of a good rule of thumb to try to achieve if you can. And unless you're trying to match up to an existing grade, such as the entrance of a barn that you're already working with, you know, not building new, you don't want to excavate out soil. So what you want to try to do is build up as much as you can and not dig down. Sometimes if you dig down, you can actually end up hitting some kind of a seep or spring or something like that in the ground, as well as just kind of having more of the surface water potentially come into the area. So if you build this gravel pad up, it really helps keep the area high and dry. And in this video, so one of the problems we are having is that we are unable to play sound for our videos. We found that the platform that we're using, the GoToMeeting, which we haven't purchased GoToWebinar yet, but this GoToMeeting platform doesn't allow us to play sound with our videos. And so I apologize. This is just going to be a video that I'm going to talk about as it's playing. And so in this particular instance, these folks had a heavy use area and it was too flat. And so what they decided to do is completely redo it and get a 1 to 2% slope that goes away from their barn so that it's not draining back into their barn. This excavator here, he is digging out, which, like I mentioned earlier, we don't recommend, but unfortunately, since this barn was already here, already installed, they do have to dig out in order to match up with the grade of this concrete that's here in front, and then they'll just fill it all back up with gravel to kind of match the existing concrete there on the barn. So this is what properly prepared native soil looks like. You know, fairly nice and smooth. There might be just a little bit of a hump or bump here and there, but for the most part, you want to really try to smooth this out as best you can so that when you do the next step of one of the next steps of laying the geotextile fabric, that there's not going to be a lot of opportunities for it to have kind of a big lump here and a big lump there, because those could be areas that you might get a little bit of ponding or other issues. And so you can see in this situation that this is also a barn that these folks are working with, that they're having to dig down just a little bit in order to match up with the the grade that this barn is already on. So if there was no barn here, you know, they wouldn't have to excavate out like they are. They just scrape off a little bit of sod and then add the gravel back on. But this is also another example of where they are having to dig down just a little bit. Okay, so now we're going to get into the geotextile fabric. This is a very heavy-duty fabric that is commonly used in road building. So a lot of forest roads or even just gravel roads for folks building in foothill soils and things like that. The the contractors are going to put down this fabric underneath the rock. And like I mentioned earlier, it keeps that gravel from sinking down into the native soil, so you're not constantly having to add more gravel, and it doesn't end up costing more money to keep adding that gravel. So it does somewhat allow water to go through, but it mainly really prevents the mud from coming up. So that's kind of the big goal of this geotextile fabric. It can be found at places like Angelus Millwork. Boy, I'm blanking on where else. I know there's some places in Squim that has it as well, but typically what it's in is about a 12.5 or 15-foot long roll, and then you can actually go into the store and buy it by the 1-foot section. So for instance, you could buy 100 feet, and that 100-foot section would be 100 feet by 12.5 feet wide. And it's best to get the heavy duty that's kind of a woven material, almost sort of like a tarp, versus the light duty material, which is felt like. I think I have the next slide I have here. Yes, the next slide I have here shows what the differences are. The geotextile fabric over here, it's very shiny. It's, like I mentioned, kind of like a tarp. It's woven. Whereas this felt like material, it is, just more like kind of a landscape felt, but it does not hold up over time. This material, the true geotextile woven material, will last for many, many years. I have one that I built, I believe it was about 15 years ago or so, and really there's no damage to the material. Versus this one over here that has the felt. This one actually started to disintegrate, and I believe the mud did actually start to come up in a couple different places after just a few years of being installed. So it's really worth it to pay a little bit more money and stick with this material that is the much more heavy duty material. Oh, I'm going to back up one slide and actually make mention of something. So in this particular slide, this was actually one that I built. We dug a little trench around the edges so we could tuck the geotextile fabric in to kind of keep the edges from unraveling. It's certainly not necessary, but that is one more step to kind of keep it all just sort of like neat and tidy. And then the other thing that we did is we used fabric staples to staple. They're kind of like a big, long, maybe like a 4 to 6 inch staple basically. And you go and you pound them in various places around the fabric. So that way, we'll see in a couple slides later, the dump truck could actually just back right over to spread the gravel, and it didn't make the fabric shift a whole bunch and cause any bunching or anything like that. It kept it in good position, so it was able to be driven on to be spread with gravel. And then the other thing is if you have your 1 to 2% slope, you want to try to make sure that when you overlap your material, that if any water is draining down this way, you can see how it wouldn't go underneath the material. It would actually go over the top of it. So kind of lay your seams so that they go with the grade and that water can't get in underneath them. And then in this slide over here, you can see that they're beginning to build a perimeter, which we're going to get into in just a minute as well. Here we are in the building perimeter. It's good to retain the gravel. It's not a have to, but some of the most successful heavy use areas that we have seen, I'd say the longevity is increased by building kind of a perimeter. So you almost are building a sandbox for gravel, so a gravel box basically. You can use railroad ties, cedar fence posts, pressure treated boards, anything like that to just basically lay down right along the edge of your geotextile fabric, and then build the gravel up right against them to retain the gravel so that the gravel isn't spilling out all into the native soil. When it spills out onto the native soil, the grass just tends to start to grow up, and it just, over time, it can be a little bit more of a maintenance hassle. And these these railroad ties are actually, this is one of the ones that I have built. The rebar stakes were used to anchor these. So there's holes drilled in each end of the railroad ties, and then a 3-foot section of rebar was drove down into the soil to kind of help keep these in place so that they didn't move. And the other thing that I did is I made sure that the fence was put on the perimeter of these railroad ties. That way the horses aren't walking directly on the edge of the railroad tie. What can happen if they are, it just tends to start to push the railroad ties outwards. And the same thing, even if you had no perimeter, you didn't use any railroad ties and you just laid your gravel right down, and then, you know, right alongside of it was the grass, you'd still want to put your fence offset a foot, maybe even 2 feet, to keep the animals from walking right along the edge of the gravel, which would cause it to slough off over time. And it may even cause the horses or cattle, or, you know, whatever animals you're putting on these gravel areas, to get down to the geotextile fabric. And if they do get down to that fabric and they cause a hole to be made in the fabric, it can cause the mud to seep up through these areas. So you really want to protect your geotextile fabric at all costs to ensure that you're not having that mud start to come up through a spot in the fabric that may have gotten torn. And if you do put your fence on the outside edge, just make sure you offset it by a hot wire. That alone can keep the horses backed off enough that they're not going to be walking right along the edge. So the next thing that you will do is you'll want to spread the crushed rock. And so in this instance, this is actually the same one that I've kind of been referring to that I had built. The railroad ties are already put into place on this opposite side from the dump truck, but we knew we wanted the dump truck to be able to spread along this edge to save us some time. So we had him start spreading all the rock, and then we came in after he had spread quite a few loads and put the perimeter, this other side perimeter, up along that far edge. We do recommend 5/8 minus crushed rock. That's typically going to fit through the tines of a pitchfork, and it also seems to hold up just a little bit better than using something smaller. So we've also had folks use 3/8 minus, which is completely fine. It just might break down a little bit quicker, so you might start to see a little bit more kind of like a muddy skiff on the surface, just as that rock over time with animals moving on it kind of starts to break down some. So 5/8 is a good choice. If you go bigger than 5/8, it's not going to fit through the tines of a pitchfork, and it's just a lot harder to clean up the manure on the bigger rock like that. And you want to do at least 6 inches of gravel compacted. And so you can see here, you can have your dump truck back over the top of it while they're spreading, so that they're not actually driving directly on the geotextile fabric. They'd be driving on the gravel instead. There's also a lot of hand maneuvering of the gravel, which like a concrete type style, I don't know if they're called a rake, but they're flat and you can kind of just push out the gravel, or even like a metal rake that works to kind of spread the gravel out some. Or you can also get out a tractor, and typically you're probably going to employ all 3 of these methods just to make it as simple as possible for spreading it. And some folks will use a larger size base rock underneath that 5/8 minus if their soils are very poorly drained, or if they need to build up quite a bit. So we've had a few instances where people build their barn kind of at the top of a fairly steep slope, and then they want to install one of these areas, but possibly at the far end, they might need 2 or 3 feet of material in order to, you know, bring it up so it's not such a steep slope. And so that's another time where you can use a larger size base rock just for better drainage, or perhaps the larger, like a pit run size material is typically going to be cheaper than a 5/8 minus. So you can spread that as well, and then put the 5/8 minus on top. Okay, and then a really key piece is to compact this rock as best you can. So if you don't have a contractor out there doing it that has a roller, what you're going to probably want to use is a plate compactor. As you can see this gentleman using, and I'm just going to play this video really quick so you can see they're quite easy actually. Once you are able to get them unloaded out of whatever you go to pick them up in, which I believe you can rent them at D&K Rentals and Angelus Millwork, they're almost just like a walk behind lawnmower. You can really just kind of walk behind them and they vibrate in place, and they pack down all that gravel. The other thing to note with them is you don't want to ever, with the plate compactor, go about 4 inches in depth for gravel. So you can't just put all 6 inches of gravel down at one time and then compact it. It's only going to compact about 4 inches at a time. So most people do their heavy use areas kind of in 2 shots with the gravel. They will get about 3 to 4 inches laid down and then compact it, and then get the final 2 to 3 inches down and then compact that again, just to make sure it's packed very good, because you really want these to almost be packed as hard as concrete. So I'm just going to play this video really quick so you can see him operating this. So you can see he just walked right behind it. It just kind of vibrates along. Turning, it's really, I think, about the hardest part of it. Actually, unloading it and loading it in the vehicle is probably a little bit harder. But these are very crucial to building a really well and long-lived mud-free area. Okay, so one other thing that some people like to add is a top footing. We generally don't recommend using it unless someone feels it's absolutely necessary for an animal's health or things like that. What can happen with the top footing is, like, for instance, with pea gravel, I actually had a very unfortunate circumstance with pea gravel where I put some in one section of my heavy use area, thinking it would be a great area for the horse. I just tried it. I was kind of doing it as a trial run. And, you know, it'd be a great area for her to be able to go and lay down. And then instead she would run to the area of her pen that pea gravel was in, and she'd do a sliding stop. So the pea gravel ended up mixing in with all that motion that she was doing, mixing in with the crushed rock, the 5/8 minus underneath. And the 2 of those gravels mixed together. And since the pea gravel is a round rock, it won't pack. So it was able to kind of work into that 5/8, and then she was able to start pawing in that area, which led to her pawing all the way down to the geotextile fabric, ripping a hole in it, and then the mud seeped up through there. So I dug the whole section out, I patched it, and it just never was the same. The mud would still kind of be able to seep up through that patch. So lesson learned, unless top footing is absolutely necessary, it's kind of a good idea just to stick with the 5/8 and then, you know, just kind of see if your horse does need a kind of softer area to lay down in. Sand can also be used, but there can be problems with that in that it can sometimes get some ponding. And then what we actually recommend doing instead is, if you do feel like a softer surface is needed for laying or rolling, stall mats or building kind of a sandbox in a corner using shavings, sand, or hog fuel can be a really good way to go. So for instance, this person, they actually put stall mats down here in this corner, and then it's a great spot where they can feed, and you know, there's no mud there. They can lay down in it, and then these retaining boards keep the mats and the footing. If you're going to do footing in some area like this, they would keep that in place. Okay, so oh, you know, one other thing I just want to back up for a second there. If you do pea gravel, we have had people have success, especially if they have older horses, with doing the pea gravel over the entire heavy use area. So you know, if you do that and you maybe only do an inch or 2 of the pea gravel over the whole area, and it's kind of an older horse that isn't going to be moving quite as much and doing sliding stops like my young horse was doing, then it can be successful to do that. And we have had a couple folks do that. One that had draft horses, and the draft horses were laying down on the 5/8 minus, and they were getting kind of a little bit of sores on their hocks. So he put the pea gravel on top, and he was very happy with how that worked out. And that can also help if you have a horse that doesn't have very good feet. The pea gravel can actually be really great, and is recommended a lot of times by farriers to help stimulate the frog on the hoof for better hoof growth. So that can be another advantage to pea gravel. But again, I really would caution trying just sticking with the 5/8 first, and then only doing the top footing if there became a problem that you might need something different in there. Okay, so filter strips. This is the last thing in the construction steps that I wanted to address. And so installing filter strips that are on the the downhill side of the pen are really great to be able to capture manure and sediment that might run off the gravel area. So the width of the strip, it's kind of going to be dependent on the slope of the land, but you really want it to just slow down that water that's coming off of the gravel area and try to capture some of that manure and those sediments. So the grassy filter strips are always going to be a really nice, lush green area, you know, by the end of the horses or cattle time in the mud-free pen, just because you can see that there are some nutrients that are getting into that area. So for instance, you can see here they have their heavy use area, their gravel heavy use area, and then they have this grass area here that takes up all that. You can also put other things in there. It doesn't have to be grass. It can be shrubs or things like that, but just anything that can kind of help uptake and filter any runoff. So, you know, you really wouldn't want to have like a waterway that was just adjacent here or a bunch of gravel, you know, that then continued on to a roadside ditch. You want to try to have that grassy filter strip to keep that contaminated runoff from going anywhere into waterways. Okay, so that concludes the construction part of the mud-free heavy use areas. And so if there's any questions, I do see there is one question in the chat. Oh, yes. Thank you. Jennifer popped this up for me, that the geotextile fabric is available at Angelus Millwork, Hartnagel's, and then it may also be available directly from local contractors that do excavation earthwork. So thank you so much, Jennifer, for mentioning that. I was just having a little bit of a moment there where I couldn't remember where all we could find that. So with that, I am actually going to turn the presentation mode back over to Jennifer, and she is going to finish out the next section of our webinar, if I can figure out. So Jennifer, I think you have the reins now, is that correct?
Yes, I believe I'm good to go.
Perfect, thank you.
Awesome. Any additional questions before we move on to the next section? We're going to be talking a bit more now about maintenance and just tools for doing proper maintenance on these heavy use areas. So if anybody wants to pipe up, go ahead.
Yeah, we do have one. We do have one question. Can mud-free pens support vehicle traffic? Definitely, yes. This is built exactly like you would build a gravel road, so they certainly can. And in fact, that's just a great way to incorporate it into the barn, you know, is to build an area that you can be getting trucks in to get access for trucks, and then, you know, also be having it as an animal area. And there's no reason why they couldn't, you know, you couldn't incorporate that into a regularly used driveway, because they are built you know, basically to withstand pretty much anything. I mean, I wouldn't be driving heavy equipment on it a lot of the time here and there, but yeah, they're built to withstand that. Do you have any more thoughts on that, Jen?
No, that's perfect. A lot of times when folks are trying to learn about these, we will point out their gravel driveway and say, this is what we're going for. We want a hard, firm surface that brings the livestock up above the native soil, but also that hard, firm surface, like a driveway, for example, is a lot easier to clean. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about next, is how to maintain these areas. These are a big investment. It's a lot of labor and cost up front. And so we want you to be successful in keeping these pens, you know, mud-free for many, many years. Any other questions before we move on the construction piece of it?
We do have one more, Jen, and sure. This might be something you're going to address a little bit more about size, you know, versus like how big you want it to be for cleaning. But we had a question on what is the maximum square footage you can build a mud-free pen. Do you want to address that?
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about that. There is really no set size. A lot of times it just comes down to what you're comfortable with your livestock standing on. Horses, for example, you know, a lot of folks want them to be able to move freely, and so we have found that long, narrow shaped pens are better for facilitating movement of horses, just kind of walking up and down fence lines, keeping them active. You know, the price, the cost kind of becomes a factor on these areas. And if you can do it yourself, obviously you're going to save a bit of money there. If you hire a contractor to come in, you know, you're going to pay a little bit more. But, you know, at least $2 a square foot, probably maybe even closer to $3 a square foot to construct these areas. So a lot of times the financial part of it kind of becomes the limitation in size, but at a minimum, at least for horses, you know, you want your animal to be able to freely turn, freely be able to lie down and stand up without casting an offense. And so we've seen, Megan and I have seen over the years, you know, a variety of sizes, and bigger pens are typically easier to maintain than smaller pens. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I did start out, you know, years ago when I first built these areas with a very small pen. And from a maintenance standpoint, it is really challenging, because if you can't get out there and clean those pens, say twice a day, you know, they will grind manure into the gravel footing if they're forced to kind of walk in the area where there's manure deposited, and then it gets to be a real challenge for maintenance. So I say make them as large as you can afford to make them, but at a minimum, make sure it's at least a large enough area that animals can freely move without bumping into fences. Anything else to add to that, Megan?
I think the only other thing is that we used to kind of collect data on how much it would cost, and generally, I apologize if you mentioned this already, but about $2 a square foot is what people were usually coming in at. If you do it yourself, you can oftentimes do it a little bit cheaper, but that was kind of a good ballpark number that would help folks kind of do the initial pre-planning for how big to make their areas, just, you know, to be able to take into account the financial cost.
Exactly. Any other questions before we move on?
I don't see any more in the chat box, so I think we're good to go. Thanks for those excellent questions. That was really great, folks.
Okay, so moving on then, as far as maintenance. So like I just mentioned, we want to try to clean these pens, ideally daily. The pens that I see that look the best, that last the longest, are those pens that people just get in the habit. When you go out and feed in the morning, clean. When you go out and feed in the evening, clean. And the goal is to try to keep as much organic material out of this clean gravel footing that you've just installed. We found that if you're feeding directly on top of the surface, that can kind of build up the organic material, the hay seeds and just particles from the feed, and that can kind of plug up the footing over time. So we recommend feeding on mats or in a manger. And then the other part of this too, like Megan talked about, is a slope is pretty key. We do, if you recall back to that rainfall slide, we do get a significant amount of rain. It does vary across the county. What does not vary is we get that rain all in a very short period of time. So there's going to be times where we're going to get a storm system that moves in, and you're going to get a few inches of rain that's going to fall on this graveled area. And so if you don't maintain that slope, what will happen is you'll end up with ponding in your heavy use area or your mud-free pen. And so you want to just be pretty diligent about trying to maintain that grade so water can freely flow off the top of the surface during storm events. The first one I built, I put my retaining perimeters, I used railroad ties, and I really got them kind of stacked in tight. And what I found is that water would end up pooling up against those railroad ties during storm events. So the next time I rebuilt an area, I left some gaps between the perimeter just to make sure that water had a path out and into my filter strip. And then you probably are going to need to bring in more footing. Our ground is constantly settling. There'll be areas where livestock tend to congregate or walk, and those areas, you know, will pack up. So you'll probably need to just get in the habit of bringing in some rock every year or every few years. So I mentioned a little bit about cleaning, and this really gets, you know, directly into the mud management piece of this puzzle, because livestock manure has just a lot of moisture in it naturally. So just the simple act of cleaning up manure will really make a big difference in keeping these pens dry. The challenge is if you don't construct these mud-free gravel pens, what will happen is as soon as we start getting our fall rains, it's just going to turn into a muddy mess, and you're not going to be able to clean out what is mud and what is manure. You won't be able to push your wheelbarrow through. So once you have these gravel pens installed, cleaning up the manure on a regular basis really is going to make a long-term difference in keeping these pens around and keeping your livestock healthy. We recommend that you store your manure that's collected out of your mud-free pen in some sort of structure. If you don't have a structure, just even a pile covered with a tarp is sufficient. And you want to keep these manure piles covered because, like I mentioned, we get a large amount of rain during a very short period of time, and there will be runoff off that pile if you don't have it covered. And that runoff has all sorts of nutrients in it, which are great for getting out into your gardens and back out onto your pasture. But during the winter, if you don't have your pile covered, you're losing all those valuable nutrients, especially the nitrogen, which is what we tend to be low in around here, and it's one that moves readily with water. So you want to store that manure in a covered pile and then apply it during the growing season, which is typically April through September, on healthy pastures. If you find yourself in a situation where you have more manure on your property than you're able to use, or you don't want to take the time and the extra effort to go reapply it, we do manage a manure share program. We have what we call a supplier list. So folks who have extra horse and livestock manure will ask just some basic questions, and you can actually do this online through our website too. You can just provide some details as far as the type of manure you have, whether or not you have a tractor and you could help load someone, and then we distribute that list throughout the year to gardeners and farmers who are looking for manure to add to their gardening endeavors. So it's a pretty cool program to connect those people with too much manure to people who want manure. And so here's just a few ideas as far as manure storage and manure structures. Like I mentioned earlier, it can be as simple as just a pile covered with a tarp. Depending on where you live, tarps can be problematic. The SQUIM area is notoriously windy. So folks have been really clever with coming up with some different systems to hook tarps or to weight tarps down to keep them from flying off piles. It can be a wooden structure, which is nice for helping with composting. Ecology blocks, which are concrete ecology blocks, are another relatively inexpensive means of quickly getting a manure storage structure identified. And then the bottom right-hand picture is just kind of a deluxe composting system with a roof. So any of these applications will work. We just wanted to give you some different ideas of things that you can do with your manure pile. So like Megan mentioned earlier, we're having some troubles with our videos, and I'm going to play this clip. But you'll see kind of behind me, this is on my farm located in between Port Angeles and SQUIM. And behind me, you'll see that there's a pumpkin on a fence post and a large pumpkin patch. And I just wanted to mention that every year, my kids and I have a great time. We take composted manure from the year before. We pile it up in this particular spot, which is away from surface water and wells. And it's usually about 2 to 3 feet deep and about a 12-foot circumference. And then we plant pumpkin seeds directly in that, and the pumpkins love growing in the partially composted manure. So this video is just, I'm talking about the importance of having quality tools. And so the first Rubbermaid cart is what I love this cart. It's an all-terrain vehicle. It has all-terrain wheels. It's very easy to maneuver to get in and out of pens. When you're constructing these pens, the more gates you can afford, the easier it's going to be to clean these pens on a regular basis. But this cart is really nice because it's easy to get in and out of the gates, and it's easy to dump. And so investing in quality tools is really key. This is already kind of an unpleasant job to go out during the winter months and clean these pens. So whatever you can do to make life a little bit easier, definitely do. A lot of times during the winter, especially with freezing weather, you'll break the tines on your manure fork. Just go ahead and run down to the feed store, buy a new head for your manure fork to keep that in good working condition. We try to clean our pens every day. I have an ATV, which is parked behind me, a four-wheeler, which I will sometimes use to clean. Usually I save that for the spring and summer months, and I usually just use the hand cart for the winter. So I just load up directly in there and then dump it into my manure storage structure. You can see behind the quad there is what it's called it's a manure spreader, but it's basically a small manure spreader that is set up for, it's really ideal for 1 to 2 horses. I picked that up used, and it's just your basic drop spreader. And so I clean during the growing season when the pastures are growing and I want to try to spread my manure onto the pastures. I'll clean directly from my mud-free pens and into the manure spreader and fill that up and then drive it onto the pastures and open the gate, and then it just evenly spreads manure across the pastures. So just another option for something that can make your life a little easier. In the next video here, I also have a small Kubota on my farm, and so I can clean directly into the bucket of the Kubota. I wanted to showcase in this clip that I'm standing in one of my mud-free pens, and you can see that there's actually a slight slope down towards the barn, which is less than ideal, but I purchased a farm with an existing barn, so I didn't get to choose where I was going to put the barn and where the corral was going to be. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of maintenance and the importance of trying to keep organic material off of this pen. And you can see kind of in the forefront there's a bunch of shavings. One of my friend's ponies had suffered a really severe bout of laminitis over the summer, and so she did not have a dry pen. She had just all pasture, and so this is kind of one of the benefits of having these mud-free pens is you can use them for kind of your quote skinny lot during the year. And so because the pony was so painful, we actually bedded my heavy use area here with about 2 feet of shavings and confined her in just a small corral. But that's less than ideal because now I have all of this shavings on my pen, and that will really add to a lot of mud. I agreed to do it because I was planning on bringing in a couple inches of gravel in this pen. It's been a few years since I've done some routine maintenance in here, and it was time to bring in some more rock anyway. So the challenge with something like this is when you go to rake it and then you go to clean out the shavings, you're going to end up pulling out a lot of rock with it too. And so, you spent a lot of time and money to put the rock in, so it's not ideal to have to clean the rock back out, and then you end up with rock mixed into your compost. And, it's not ideal to be spreading gravel onto your pastures. So I just kind of wanted to use this as an example to caution folks that top footing, has to be dealt with. Also in the background, you can see there's 3 goats that are sleeping down there in the shade. Those are my daughter's goats. And I found with the small animals, or animals, I guess, that create pelleted manure, like goats, llamas, alpacas, sheep, it's pretty important to try to minimize top footing in those situations because the manure is very small, and so you're going to need to use a rake and probably a shovel. And if you have top footing small, like pea gravel or something along those lines, there's really no way to sort out that pelleted manure. So we found for the goats and the sheep that it's best to just use the 5/8 minus packed all the way up to the surface. It's just a cleaner, easier material to clean out. You'll also notice that I have a gutter down there on that little shed style roof. We moved into this farm in the fall the first year, and I cannot even express how much water just came off that little shed style roof. So our first project before we even built the gravel mud-free pen was to actually get a gutter on that roof. So we just wanted to share with you a few examples of mud-free pens that have been built around the county. And so this, for example, is a horse farm, a private horse facility up in the foothills of Swin. They do get a significant, this is pretty high in elevation, so they do get a significant amount of rainfall up in this area, and they have very poorly drained soils. So we talked a little bit about fencing, but this horse owner opted to use this style fencing, which can be easily taken down and put up. So that allows them some flexibility for bringing in additional gravel trucks. They can just easily remove all those panels, add more rock, configure the panels depending on if they have, this is a breeding operation, so they were bringing in stallions and bred mares, so they occasionally had to, you know, move around pens and such. So this is just one example. Again, they opted to just use 5/8 minus up to the surface and pack that down without any top footing. Here's just a before and after of a small farm in the Agnew area. And again, you can see this is very common. The before picture is very common for what you're going to be dealing with if you don't build one of these gravelled pens. And so a lot of wasted feed there. The animals are having to pick out feed from kind of muck. Like Megan mentioned earlier, especially so on these older animals, it's real hard on them to be standing in the wet and the cold. And so on the after picture, you can see they opted to add in some stall mats for ease of feeding and a nice mud-free paddock. Again, another before and after here too. Just, you know, it just makes, we've worked with lots of folks over the years, and they've said, gosh, I wish we would have done this years ago. It's, you know, I dreaded every winter, and how was I going to, you know, taking care of these animals really hard if you want to travel to find someone that's willing to come farm sit and deal with trudging through your mucky paddocks to go take care of your animals. So it's been a real game changer for a lot of these small operations. Again, another example here, they opted to have kind of a lane between the areas, which makes cleaning really a lot easier for getting feed into the shelter, getting your manure cart into the shelter. So just another creative layout here. And this is one pen where it was just this is in fact the one that Megan had a picture or a video of them earlier when they were doing some survey work and really working on installing that 2% slope, because you can see in the before picture, it's just super flat. They did bring in gravel footing to this pen, but because there was nowhere, they didn't have a slope, they didn't have anywhere for the water to drain, they just ended up with a lot of ponding and puddling. And even if you do everything else right, if there is no slope to the area, you're going to end up with rainwater that's going to just fill in this area. So they, decided this year, actually just a few weeks ago, to completely overhaul and develop that 2% slope so they can shed water off this pen and into their pasture area. All of this information that Megan and I went over tonight is available in a free technical guide. There are step-by-step instructions for how to build these areas, and we would love to share this with you. So we can email you a PDF of this. We routinely come out, can answer any questions. Are there any questions now on how to maintain these areas, or tips or tricks for keeping these pens in good shape?
I don't see any questions in the chat box, so I think we're good to keep going forward.
Okay, perfect. So like Megan mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, we're available to provide technical assistance. It can be just a one-time come out, take a look, what do you think, to a more comprehensive development of a conservation plan. And our plans, typically are looking at the property as a whole. So we're looking at things like soil type and slope, what sort of livestock or crops you want to have, if you've got, water features like streams or wetlands. And then we can help you come up with a plan for managing your property in such a way that's going to meet your goals for your farm and your livestock, but also ensure that you're protecting natural resources like water quality and forest health. We do offer a low-cost soil testing program, which is really great information if you're also trying to manage pasture on your farm. And like we mentioned, these mud-free pens are pretty critical for maintaining healthy pastures. And knowing kind of what condition your soil is also a key step. So we can help you out with that. We do a native plant sale every year. This year, things may be a little different, but we have a variety of bare root trees and shrubs that are available at a very low cost. These are not landscape grade plants. These are conservation plants, but it's a real popular event we do every year. And then we do manage a variety of restoration programs in our office as well. So if we don't have any other questions, we're hoping that yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we actually had one come in. Can you address if there's any point in using hoof grid in the paddocks? I don't have any experience with that. Do you have any one that you've worked with that's used that?
I don't have any direct experience. I have personally not used it myself. I am working with a horse owner right now that has very poorly drained soil, has 6 large thoroughbred style horses, and is we've done some research on how hoof grid could work in her application. It does add a considerable cost to the project, but I did check in with a couple other conservation planners from other conservation districts. Specifically, I knew that Pierce County and Pierce Conservation District had done several projects with folks that have used the hoof grid, and they said it's absolutely fabulous. They did say that you have to be pretty careful and follow the manufacturer guidelines to a T. So a lot of times it requires, you know, some base rock, and then you install the hoof grid, and then you backfill it. I think it can be a bit challenging on ground where you have a lot of topography change or some significant slope. And I only know this because that happens to be the case of this particular horse property. It's a pretty steep slope. And so that looks like it was going to be a little challenging to install the hoof grid. But yeah, I haven't personally used it myself, but I have talked to several different facilities that have used it, and they say it's fabulous, but it is, you know, quite a bit more expensive than your, and I don't have a square foot price for it, but it did add, you know, at least doubled the cost of just your traditional geotextile fabric with crushed rock heavy use area.
And there was a follow-up question to that, that it maybe would be helpful around high traffic areas like gate areas. Did you talk to the planners by chance over there to see if they'd used them in any applications like that?
Yeah, so I did specifically ask that, and also asked about equipment use, and they said yes to all those things. They've used them routinely in gateways, and they've used them in areas, like one in particular was a boarding facility, and they had a gate where they were bringing a lot of tractors in and out that they were using for feeding, and they said it was fabulous. And so I feel like when I talked to that particular planner, she said it's absolutely worth it if you've got this problem area and you just can't, you know, you've tried the traditional methods and it just is receiving too much traffic, that hoof grid, the way it's designed, it just adds an extra engineering layer of stability that you sometimes can't get in these really poorly drained, mucky soils.
Fantastic. I think that answered those questions, Jen. So thank you for addressing that.
Yeah. So, we're going to be sending out just an email with a link for a quick survey, and we would super appreciate your feedback on this event. This is the first time we've had to do a virtual kind of webinar style. Our typical events are usually in person on farm tours. So we're hoping to try to get more video clips and a better kind of format for folks to actually see what's worked on other farms and hear from other horse and livestock owners and farmers about what's worked well for them and what hasn't. So that will be coming, so check your email for that. And also, if you end up doing any of these practices kind of on your own, and of course, give us a call, Megan and I a call, or send us an email if you want us to come out and take a look. But if you end up doing any of these, we love to get before and after photos. It's really useful for workshop venues and educational events. So if you don't mind doing that, that would be very helpful as well. So with that, you can contact us. If you visit our website, we have an On the Farm page that has a lot of information on keeping horses and livestock on farms. And on that page, there's also a link to sign up to a horse and livestock mailing list. And so we are going to try to be sending out materials, directly. We have a newsletter that goes out on a monthly basis, an e-newsletter, but we wanted to provide very targeted, specific information specifically for horse and livestock owners. So add your name to that list if you're interested. And then our phone number is there at the bottom. So if we can be of assistance, please just give us a call. Anything else? Any other questions before we sign off for the evening?
I think that was all of them. I think we're able to wrap up now.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you to those who joined, and check your email. We'll be sending out a link. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.